Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. So, first of all, I just want to start by saying sorry for the bit of radio silence over the past month or so. Between school, work, and a generally chaotic schedule, May and the first half of June turned out to be a bit overwhelming. And, unfortunately, the garden got caught in the middle of that. I didn't really have the time or energy to care for it the way I would have liked, and that meant not only less frequent uploads here, but also a bit of neglect on the actual plants themselves. That said, the garden kept going. Nature has its own rhythm, and even if I wasn't always keeping up, the plants were doing their thing. Radishes bolted, snails feasted, tomatoes ripened, and summer started to roll in whether I was ready or not. But now that the things have settled a bit, I've been able to get back into the garden more consistently, and I'm finally catching up with everything that's been going on, which is a lot actually. We've had harvests, replantings, losses, small wins, new experiments, and a few surprises along the way. So let's get into it. June 2nd. So, the month of June started with a big, messy, satisfying task pulling out the last of the radishes. It was already getting a bit too hot for them, and by this point, many of the plants had started to bolt and flower. That's usually the sign they are done, or at least they think they are. Some of them didn't fully develop, which is always a bit of a bummer, but that's part of the growing food in unpredictable weather. Still, I was honestly blown away by the total 4,077 grams of radishes. That's over 4 kilos. Absolutely wild. After I brought them home, I gave them a proper wash and cleanup, trimming off the tops, sorting out the ones that were still decent despite bolting. It felt like a proper send-off to one of the season's earliest success stories. Next up, I finally got around to planting out my parthenocarpic salad cucumbers. These are the kind that don't need pollination to grow fruit, which makes them great for small gardens or balconies. But in my case, I planted them right into the outdoor garden. I placed them next to the sunflowers that managed to survive the May cold snap. The idea is that as the cucumbers grow, they will use the tall sunflower stalks as a natural trellis. It's a bit of an experiment. Not sure how well it will work, but it feels like something that might actually make sense. Nature supporting nature. Back at home, I checked in on my windowsill tomato patch, which is still doing its thing even as the plants start to look a bit tired. I picked 241 grams of tomatoes. Not a huge haul, but still fresh, red, juicy, and very much appreciated. It's not the glory days of late May anymore, but hey, it's always nice to see them hanging in there. And finally, I decided to give some of my summer crops a second chance. Back in May, I lost most of the zucchinis, melons, and pumpkins, either to slugs or just poor light and slow growth. But now the weather's warming up properly, and it felt like the right time to try again. And then, probably the most hopeful part of the day, I transplanted a new round of squash, melons, and zucchini seedlings into the outdoor garden. These were the backup plants I had started earlier in May, after most of the first batch didn't make it. This time I gave them a little help, placed large jars over each seedling, creating a mini greenhouse effect while also protecting them from slugs and snails, which were a huge problem last time. It looked a bit odd, but sometimes that's what gardening is. A weird little battlefield of improvised defenses and second chances. We'll see how this round goes. June 3rd. After yesterday's big garden hustle, June 3rd was a bit calmer. More about planning ahead than harvesting or planting outside. This time, I turned my attention back to the windowsill tomato patch. As I mentioned earlier, the original Wilmot tomato plants are starting to show their age. Yellowing leaves, thinning growth, less energy. They've given us a lot of fruit already, but it's pretty clear they're winding down. So I decided it was time to start preparing their replacements. I sowed a few seeds of a variety called Aztec. They are very similar to Wilma, small, bushy, determinate tomatoes, perfect for growing indoors, but this time with bright yellow fruit instead of red. The plan is to raise them slowly throughout June and July and then swap them into the windowsill setup once the Wilmas finish up, probably in late July. And while I was at it, I also started a few seeds of tumbling tom. This is much weirder, more playful variety. Instead of growing upright, these tomatoes tumble down from hanging pods like little waterfalls of fruit. I'm still not sure exactly where I'll put them, but we will figure that out when the time comes. Maybe they'll end up on the balcony. Since both Aztec and Tumbling Tom, just like Wilma, are determinate varieties, they'll tend to produce their fruit in one big wave and then stop. So, if everything goes right, we will have another round in the fall from these new plants. Two full harvests from the same windowsill. That's the dream, at least. June 4th. The next day, on June 4th, I headed back to the outdoor garden to check in on all the plants I have transplanted just 2 days earlier. And, right away, not the best news. Some of my sunflowers and a few of the cucumber plants had already been chewed up pretty badly. It seems like the snails found them fast, especially those left more exposed. Thankfully, the melons, zucchinis, and squash were still doing okay, probably because they were protected under glass jars. These jars acted like mini greenhouses and snail barriers, which clearly paid off, at least for now. But it wasn't all bad. I also checked on my strawberries, and almost all of them were looking amazing. Most plants were still in bloom, and several were already starting to form small green fruits. They are a bit behind the balcony ones, but these outdoor strawberries are older and more established, so I'm expecting a decent harvest once they catch up. Since I had some space left in the beds, and clearly a few casualties already, I decided to sow a few more seeds directly into the soil. I tossed in some extras of everything: melons, cucumbers, sunflowers, zucchinis, and squash. The idea was to replace anything that might not make it and maybe get a late crop going too. The weather was warm, so there was still a good chance for a second round of summer veggies. And remember the mystery fruit bush I've been talking about? Well, I'm now almost certain it's a black currant. The fruit clusters are forming, and the leaves match. It's looking very healthy, and it's even starting to fill up with fruit, which is a nice surprise. But the garden bed around it still looked a little bare and neglected. So I decided to have a bit of fun and go full chaos gardening mode. So I threw in a random mix of parsley, basil, dill, chives, and marigold seeds, just to see what would happen. No spacing, no rows, no real plan. Just a burst of herbal and floral anarchy around the base of the currant bush. Hopefully, something sprouts, and if it does, it will be a nice, slightly wild corner of the garden. June 5th. On June 5th, it finally happened. I spotted the very first ripe strawberry of the season on the balcony. June 7th. On the June 7th, I headed out for another check-in with the garden. Out in the outdoor beds, things were actually looking really solid. The strawberries are still flowering beautifully, and there are more and more fruits forming. The sunflowers and cucumbers despite earlier setbacks, are holding steady. They look like they've settled in and are growing stronger. And the melons, squash, and zucchini, they are doing surprisingly well. Those mini greenhouses made from jars seem to be paying off. Then it was time to go back indoors. I did another harvest from the windowsill tomato patch. This time I collected 531 grams of tomatoes. The plants might be aging, but they are still giving. On the balcony though, things took a turn. My salad greens and bok choy had both clearly started to bolt. Tall stalks, flower buds, the works. I knew I'd have to harvest them soon before they go bitter. But for now, I gave the bok choy a gentle rinse under the shower and moved the pots indoors to the shelf. Hopefully, they'll stay fresh just a little longer until I'm ready to cook them. It felt like a bit of a turning point. Greens making way for summer crops, tomatoes still coming in strong, and everything else slowly picking up the speed. June 8th. On June 8th, I headed out to check on the garden again. And yeah, the snails were back. I found several of them munching on my sunflowers and cucumbers, especially the ones I had just transplanted earlier in the month. I tossed them away by hand and decided to try an old trick from last year, beer traps. I poured some cheap beer into small dishes and placed them around the plants, hoping they would lure the snails in like they did with the slugs last season. But apparently, snails aren't fans of beer the way slugs are. The traps stayed empty, and the snails kept on creeping. So I went back to manual removal, especially after it rained. Definitely not the most glamorous method, but it works. Back on the balcony, it was time for a small but satisfying win. I harvested one of my 2 containers of bok choy. Even though it had started to bolt, the leaves were still tender and fresh, and I ended up with 863 grams of bok choy from just 1 container. Not bad at all, especially considering these plants were still pretty young. June 9th. On June 9th, I went out to check on the balcony garden again, and I was greeted with a few more ripe strawberries hanging from the pots. Just a small handful, but still such a nice reward. They are sweet, juicy, and honestly one of my favorite little treats to pick. Nearby, the marigolds I planted last month are looking strong. They are still quite small, but they've definitely taken off and are growing steadily in their little pots. I'll move them to the outdoor garden once they are a bit bigger and ready to handle the real world. June 14th. June 14th started quietly, with a walk out to the garden to check on the strawberries. At first glance, everything looked about the same. Plants full of life, leaves green and thick, and plenty of flowers. But as I got closer, I started noticing it. Roots everywhere, still mostly green, but now unmistakably strawberries, forming and growing. The little white flowers had turned into clusters of slowly blushing fruit. It felt like the calm before the real harvest wave. But I did manage to find a handful of ripe berries hiding under the leaves. Just 84 grams, but still, they felt like a small victory. The first real garden strawberry harvest of the season. Later in the day, I turned my attention to the indoor tomato patch, which has been quietly pumping out fruit all month. I'd already been picking here and there in early June, but on the 14th, the plants had clearly coordinated something big. Ended up harvesting 1122 grams of ripe tomatoes, over a kilo of sweet, compact fruit from just a few square meters of the windowsill. But while the fruit is still coming, the plants themselves are starting to fade. Leaves are yellowing, some browning at the tips, especially on those in more shaded corners of the patch. Some of the fruit clusters look a little smaller than the earlier ones. It's pretty clear that they are entering their final stage. Not a total surprise. These are determinate varieties after all. They grow fast, fruit heavily, and then start to shut down. Still, they've done incredibly well, and I'm happy to let them finish on their own terms. Up on the balcony, it was time to say goodbye to another crop, the salad greens. Before the leaves turned bitter, I gave them one last good shower soak, both to rehydrate them and clean them. The leaves were a bit droopy, but still tender and sweet. Final harvest weight 486 grams of salad greens. June 19th. A few days later, on June 19th, it was finally time to collect the last batch of bok choy from the balcony. This second container had been left to grow just a little longer than the first, and it didn't really pay off. The plants weren't bigger or fuller. In fact, most of them were bolting now. Like with the salad greens, I gave them a nice long soak in the shower, which always makes the leaves perk up a bit and makes cleaning way easier. Then came the cut and the final tally 638 grams of crisp, slightly peppery bok choy. June 20th turned out to be one of those slower but deeply satisfying garden days. The kind where you don't do a lot of heavy lifting, but all the little tasks come together into something that feels complete. First up, parsley. This humble herb has been quietly growing all spring in a small pot tucked right next to the tomatoes. And it was thriving. Tall, dense, and lush green, it was starting to overshadow its neighbors. So I decided it was finally time for the first full harvest. I snipped all the stems down at the base, bunch by bunch, and ended up with 138 grams of parsley. Fragrant, fresh, and way more than I expected from such a small container. I didn't toss the pot though. The roots are still healthy, and there is a decent chance some new shoots will sprout back for a second round later in the season. Next, I turned to the indoor cucumber gang. There were still 6 plants growing inside, leftovers from the earlier batch I planted out in the garden. But by now it was clear they'd outgrown their little starter pots. The vines were stretching, leaves getting oversized, and one plant had already started growing a tiny cucumber. It was definitely time to get them out of their cramped quarters and into the soil. Before heading out though, I paused to check in on the basil I'd planted next to the tomatoes a while ago. It had a pretty slow start, but now that we are deep into summer sun, it finally began to thrive. I removed a few weak-looking seedlings and left the 3 strongest ones to continue growing in the pot. Basil is one of those herbs that really benefits from early pruning, so I grabbed my scissors and gave each of the 3 plants a proper haircut. I snipped them all the way down to their second pair of leaves, which may seem drastic, but it's the key to building a bushy, productive basil plant. With each cut, you encourage 2 new shoots to grow, so with a little patience and regular snipping, these plants will eventually branch into a nice dense herb bouquet. Finally, I picked up the leggy cucumbers and took them out to the garden. I had a spot waiting for them near some of the earlier cucumber transplants and sunflowers. The soil was warm, the sun was strong, so it felt like the perfect time. I nestled all 6 cucumber plants into the ground and gave them a deep drink of water. Before heading back in, I took a walk around the beds. Despite the previous losses, everything was coming along steadily. Squash, sunflowers, cucumbers, even the chaos garden I had started around the black currant bush was beginning to sprout little green surprises. Random herbs and marigolds, and who knows what else. It's all starting to push through the soil now. Not a big harvest day, not a massive planting season, but a perfect garden day nonetheless. June 23rd started off with a goal. The sun was out and it was finally starting to feel like true summer. and I figured it was time to address a little gaps in the garden. A bunch of my squash seedlings, the ones I had carefully grown from seed earlier this season, didn't survive the great snail invasion, or just didn't take off the way I hoped. So I decided to head into town to try and hunt down some replacements. Now, the tricky thing about squash in late June is, well, it's late June. Garden centers have moved on, the seedlings are picked over, and everything is either overgrown or out of stock. Most of the earlier varieties I had started were small, bush-type melons and zucchinis, bred for tight spaces and raised beds. But now, no such luck. I finally found two lone survivors sitting quietly in a small crate outside a local shop. Butternut squash seedlings, looking surprisingly healthy and just begging for a second chance. Now, anyone who's grown butternuts knows they are not small. These are sprawling, whining beasts that like to spread out, climb over everything, and stake their claim like they own the place. Not exactly ideal for raised beds or tight spaces, just like mine. But I figured, hey, I've got a few open spots left, and with a bit of careful placement, some pruning, or just pure optimism, maybe I can make it work. I mean, the worst case scenario is that I will end up with a big leafy mess, and the best case scenario is a sweet fall butternut harvest. Later in the day, I shifted my attention to the windowsill tomato patch, which is slowly approaching the end of its glory days. On this day, I did a full windowsill harvest and came away with a total of 489 grams. From the first window, I got 200 grams, from the second window, I got 170 grams, and from the third window, I got 118 grams. I have to say, this indoor setup really delivered this spring and early summer. The harvest haven't been massive all at once, but they've been steady. Later that same day, once the butternut squash mission was complete and Franza had finished her inspection duties, I turned my attention back to the balcony garden. It is a runner season, the time of year when your strawberry plants suddenly decide to become hydra-headed monsters, sending long red vines out in every direction like they are trying to take over the world. Some of the hanging baskets were already sending multiple runners, and the garden strawberries had joined the rebellion too. So I grabbed a few clips and started doing some intentional propagation. I redirected a few runners into nearby empty pots and soil gaps, guiding them down gently, letting them root where I actually want more plants. The rest I snipped off and placed into a shallow bowl of water, along with runners I had already collected from the outdoor garden earlier, hoping they'll form roots in a few days and can be transplanted into new containers or beds. It's a bit like gardening chess, thinking a few moves ahead and making sure next year's strawberry army is already in the making. While we're talking about strawberries, something exciting finally happened in the garden. The outdoor strawberry bed finally hit its stride. After weeks of flowering and teasing, the plants suddenly decided it was time, and I ended up with a solid harvest. A full 540 grams of fresh, red, sun-warmed strawberries. This felt like the first real strawberry moment of the year. Not just a handful here and there, but an actual harvest you can smell when you walk past the bowl. Sweet, soft, and very much worth the wait. And just as I thought the day was wrapping up, I settled in for the evening. And then boom! I was woken up by the first proper summer thunderstorm of the year. You know the type. The air gets thick and weird, the sky turns a deep blue-gray, and then it all cracks open. Thunder, wind, sheets of rain, and flashes lighting up the entire neighborhood. These storms are beautiful but brutal. I've had years where they snapped plants in half, flooded containers, or tossed balcony pots across the railing. Luckily, this one was fast and fairly mild, just enough to give the air a good cleaning and send the plants a drink. As soon as the storm passed and the sky lightened again, I put on some shoes and went out to the garden for a quick inspection. The garden was glistening, with rain still dropping off squash leaves and sunflowers. And to my surprise, everything looked fine. No damage, no snapped stems, just the usual soggy mulch and slightly overwatered look that passes quickly once the sun returns. It felt like a little reminder. Summer has officially arrived, and the garden, in all its chaos and beauty, is entering its high season. The moment I woke up on the 24th, I already knew what my first mission was. The air was still damp from last night's thunderstorm, and that kind of weather always brings one thing: snails. Lots of them. So I pulled on my shoes and headed out to the garden, and yeah, they were everywhere. With the slimy menace dealt with, for now, I headed back out, this time into the city. The goal: fill the last remaining gaps in the garden with whatever squash I could still find this late in the season. Luckily, I stumbled upon 4 Hokkaido squash seedlings. Now, these aren't exactly small plants, not as huge as butternuts, but definitely not ideal for tight urban beds either. As a bonus, I also spotted a single cayenne pepper plant, and of course I couldn't say no to that. Back home, I didn't waste any time. I headed straight out to the garden and planted the 4 Hokkaidos into the remaining spaces, one in each of the beds that had empty corners from earlier snail damage or failed seedlings. These beds are already a bit chaotic, but I tried to tuck each squash into a spot where it could spread without smothering the rest. Then I found the perfect spot for the cayenne pepper, right in the middle between 2 of the squash plants, a little island of spice surrounded by vines. It felt satisfying to finally get every plant bed filled. Sure, it's a bit overstuffed now, but it's my kind of messy, wild, experimental, and just bursting with life. On June 26th, the day started out simple. I stepped into the garden with a small bowl, expecting to maybe pick a few ripe strawberries here and there. But as I moved through the beds, I kept spotting more and more red dots peeking through the leaves, tucked under stems, dangling at the edges, hiding beneath shade. By the end of it, I ended up with 209 grams of strawberries, freshly picked and still warm from the sun. Not the biggest harvest of the month, but a sweet and steady continuation of the strawberry wave that had just begun. Later that day, I decided to head back into the city. Honestly, the lone cayenne pepper I planted a couple of days ago had been stuck in my mind. It looked so good and promising. I figured, why not lean into it? So I went plant hunting again. This time, I brought back 3 more pepper plants. One Alma paprika, a round, pale variety that can go from sweet to slightly spicy, and 2 varieties of sweet capia peppers, long, white, or green, and mild, perfect for roasting or eating raw. With them in hand, I went straight to the garden and did exactly what I did with the cayenne. I planted each pepper in the center of 3 remaining large beds, 1 per bed. This now means that every big bed has a central pepper surrounded by a mix of squash, sunflowers, cucumbers, and strawberries. Before heading back inside, I decided to push my luck just a little further. I had picked up some fresh cucumber and sunflower seeds while I was out, and even though we are already well into summer, I figured, Why not try again? So I direct sowed both cucumbers and sunflowers into open pockets of soil, hoping that with the warm nights and consistent watering, they'll sprout quickly and catch up in time for a late summer harvest. Oh, and by the way, these cucumbers are also parthenocarpic, which means they don't need pollination. But this time I went for pickling cucumbers. The night of the 26th brought another summer rain. Not a thunderstorm this time, but a long, soft rainfall that lasted well into the early morning. And, as always, when the rain comes, so do the snails. So, on the morning of the 27th, I went down to the garden, armed with nothing but sleepy eyes and my hands. And sure enough, they were everywhere again, slimy, slow, and extremely confident. This time, I didn't bother with beer traps or fancy setups. I just did my usual routine, pick them up and eat them away. Despite the gastropod invasion, the garden looked really good. The newly planted butternut squash, Hokkaidos, and peppers all seemed to be settling in well. Their leaves were looking better than the day before, already reaching towards the light. It is always a relief to see that the late transplants are taking hold. This part of the summer, where the garden is still young and energetic, but starting to show hints of structure, is one of my favorite moments in the growing season. On 28th, I headed back into the windowsill tomato patch. There were still a few fruits ready, so I gently plucked them off one by one. This time I got 227 grams. Not bad at all, but yeah, we are definitely on the decline now. It's pretty clear that the first flush is winding down. The plants are starting to look more tired. Leaves are yellowing here and there, and the fruit clusters are smaller and more scattered. Some of the stems are drying out already, and you can just tell they are near the end of their cycle. That's how it goes with these determinate varieties. They give it their all for a month or so and then fade. But it's okay. We knew this was coming. And thanks to those Aztec and Tumbling Tom seedlings we planted earlier in the month, we are already preparing for round 2. Fall tomatoes, here we come. June 30th. As June came to close, I made one final round through the garden to see how everything was doing. And honestly, it looked great. The plants are settling into the rhythm of summer now, soaking up the warmth and slowly shifting into full production mode. One of the more exciting developments. I noticed that my giant pumpkin plant is starting to form flower buds. That means it's getting close to blooming. And once that starts, if pollination goes well, we'll be on our way to growing a truly massive fruit. It's still early, but the potential is definitely there. Nearby, I spotted my first decently sized cucumber fruit growing on one of the vines. And there are tiny cucumbers forming everywhere, which means a full cucumber harvest is just around the corner. So far, the cucumbers seem happy climbing up the sunflowers and surviving the occasional snail raid. The new peppers and squash seedlings I planted earlier this week are also looking strong. They are perking up, no signs of transplant shock, and already putting out new growth. Looks like they are adapting well to their new beds and should start filling in the remaining garden gaps nicely. And speaking of the garden's guardians, the giant sunflowers are now about as tall as me, standing proud and leafy, stretching upwards with serious determination. Still, no flowers forming just yet, but they are definitely getting close. The black currant bush is absolutely loaded with fruit now, most of it already darkened and just days away from being fully ripe. It won't be long before I do a proper berry harvest, but for now I'm letting it ripen just a little more. I also collected a few more strawberries from the garden, just 83 grams this time. A small but sweet little haul to close out the month. And back on the windowsill, I wrapped up June with one final tomato harvest. 284 grams. A nice send-off from the Wilmas before they start fading for good. And that just about wraps up June, a month of strawberries, snail hunts, surprise thunderstorms, and trying to cram way too many squash into way too little space. The indoor tomato patch is clearly slowing down, but I'm already prepping the next generation. Meanwhile, the garden outside is finally picking up speed. The giant sunflowers are nearly as tall as me, and the black currant bush is almost ready for its moment. Honestly, June was a bit of a recovery arc. After the May chaos and all the school and work overload, I finally got the chance to breathe and reconnect with the garden again. And yeah, it fought back a bit. But I think we are slowly getting back on track. July is already looking exciting. More fruit, more harvests, more pests to battle. And definitely more tomatoes. Always more tomatoes. Thanks for watching. And as always, give your plants a little water, give your cat a little treat, and I'll see you in the next one.